Since the cell-based meat or cultivated meat sector broke out onto the scene in the APAC region, a lot has been discussed about the technology behind this, as well as the specific potential products that could arise from it. Today, we want to delve into a much less discussed area of the sector, which is the regulatory landscape. Here with me today to discuss this in more detail is Elaine Siu, Managing Director for the APAC region at the Good Food Institute, or GFI. So hello Elaine, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Very good to have you here, Elaine. Thank you so much again. I understand, Elaine, that GFI uses the term cultivated meat. So I'm happy to stick to that for this interview. And maybe I just like to start off by asking you this. So what is your take on the regulatory landscape for cultivated meat products in the APAC region right now? And what sorts of progress perhaps have you seen over the last 2 to 3 years?
Actually, it's very exciting, I believe, to be in the APAC region because quite a few governments are actually looking into this, and I have indeed seen a lot of progress in the past 2 years. Two examples. One, Singapore. Singapore government is very, very positive about the development of cultivated meat as part and parcel of the alternative protein space because of food security issues, etc. So we have been sort of in constant, we've been in touch with the Singapore government agencies to see how we can help with developing the regulatory regime in Singapore. And we are very happy to see that the government is very committed in actually creating this regime to support the sector. So that's very, very promising. My personal feeling is that the first cultivated meat product is probably going to be approved in Singapore. So we'll see. After the pandemic happened, like a lot of governments are now getting more interested, if not more positive, about like this being part of the solution and to kind of future-proof. So we'll see. I like a little bit of competitiveness that's going on amongst countries as well. The other government is Japan. The Japanese government is a very different situation in Japan because under the regulations, basically cultivated meat is not considered novel ingredient. Therefore, theoretically, cultivated meat product can go into market like today. There is no new regulations that need to be created for these products to go into market. However, we do know that industry groups are now working together to create industry standards, because I think that is important. So it's not just the law, the regulations, but also having some sort of industry standard, especially for really new products like that consumers know very little about, to create that feeling, that trustworthy feeling. So that is again very exciting because the law isn't even in the way.
In your opinion, how does the cultivated meat regulatory landscape in APAC compare to other regions? For example, the US, in Europe, or perhaps in Israel, which is one of the most advanced, as most of us do know. Which, could APAC perhaps look to for lessons per se?
It's quite complicated in terms of like different regions or different countries having existing regulatory regime, and how does cultivated meat kind of work within that regime, and what new regulations need to be created, etc., to make sense of the whole thing. But from what I understand, definitely in the US and Europe, there are a lot of efforts into looking into creating regulations that would cater for these products going to market. Personally, I do think, though, that we might see faster development actually from APAC region. As I mentioned, well, Japan already does not need a new law or new regulation to be passed. So that's a big hurdle. Like that is basically a lot more advanced than a lot other places in terms of where the regulatory landscape is at. Singapore, definitely the regulators are are, because of the commitment they have, I believe, in bringing these products to market as soon as they can. I do think we might actually see Asia leading the regulatory development in this space.
Coming back to what you mentioned about APEC maybe being able to lead this cultivated meat governance, so what sort of timelines do you think we are looking at? Do you think it's closer to 5 years, 10 years maybe?
5 years to 10 years, that's a long time. I actually definitely don't think it will take that long. So, which is very exciting, right? I do know that for Singapore, my guess is that we will hear news in sort of the next year or so, because the regulator is already taking in applications, looking at applications, and sort of developing the safety assessment protocol, etc. As we go. And as I mentioned, Japan, it is literally any time a product can come to market. So I don't think we're looking at a 5 to 10 year timeline at all from a regulatory perspective. Now, when are the markets ready to actually go to market because of cost, because of the ability to scale up, to actually go to market? That is a separate timeline. But I don't think the regulation, especially in APAC, is the factor that is going to delay it to a 5 to 10 year time frame.
For all these regulations that we've mentioned, for cultivated meat products, what do you think is the most likely route that this will go through? I know you mentioned in Japan it's not going to be a novel food, but the most common one is, for it to be regulated as a novel food. And there are many, many challenges associated with this. Are there any potential routes besides novel food regulation?
So I agree that in most countries that we've seen, there are some sort of novel food or novel food ingredients route that people are thinking about putting cultivated meat into, and thinking in that direction. But again, I think using, let's say, Japan as an example, really it's in the nuances that we need to look at. So for instance, I talked to a startup recently about why it is approaching cultivated meat or the production of cultivated meat a certain way, which is that they don't include external growth serum in the production. And they explained to me that it's because when something external is added, like a growth factor is added, it then becomes a novel ingredient, and they don't want their product to fall into that. So they basically, because of the regulatory regime and how to work well with the regulation and make it as easy as possible, they also don't use cells that would fall into being GMO. Because GMO, again, is another route within the Japanese regulatory regime, which will make it a lot more difficult to be approved. So it is really the nuances in every different regulatory regime in different jurisdictions that I think we need to look at, and startups and product innovators need to look at to figure out how they can basically work with the system and not make it more difficult for themselves when it comes to product approval.
Okay, great. So basically, what I'm hearing now is that it very much has to do with the nuances. It has to do with the way the products are formulated. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Very interesting. Yeah. Thanks so much for that. So, in terms of challenges, that are and issues that are preventing these cultivated product regulations from being approved, what are some of the most major ones that you have seen that are still ongoing in the APAC region?
I think the biggest challenge is that it's a bit of a chicken and egg issue. So the regulators need to see what startups are actually coming out with, and the R&D and the innovation is happening on a daily basis. So the two are actually going in parallel, the regulator and the startups. So the regulators kind of need to look to what products are the startups creating, And so how then they need to create a structure to actually assess these products. And the startups are looking to the regulators to see, well, what are the regulators concerned about and what are the regulators looking at in order to get their products approved. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg issue right now. I think that is quite challenging, and that is why for a government like the Singapore government, that is obviously very committed to actually develop something that would facilitate the growth of this sector, then it makes it much easier, because the government, the regulator, is actually proactive in talking to the startups and getting preliminary, whether it's even if it's not formal application, but just get into that conversation of understanding what they're developing, what they are thinking about. It has to be kind of a parallel development, the product development as well as the regulation development.
I still notice that many of these firms have managed to secure large investments, like Turtle Tree Labs most recently, so why would you say that so many millions of dollars of investment are still able to be secured by these startups per se, even with such uncertainty in place, all the chicken and egg conundrums in place? How big is the probability, in your opinion, that all this money can definitely and soon be translated into commercially viable products?
So first of all, it is a chicken and egg issue, but that is the challenge, but I think we can get past that if we work on, as I mentioned, the regulator and the startup work hand in hand in parallel, and with a common goal of creating these products that in a safe way that will be acceptable to the consumers. So I am actually very optimistic that this is not really a maybe. This is just when it's gonna happen. So going back to why these startups are able to secure investment money, even though nothing is really certain at this point, I believe it's because it is certain that the current system does not work. So we do need a solution. And that is for sure. So the certainty is there that we need to develop something because the current system does not work. The current system that completely rely on animal agriculture, including factory farming, especially there is a realization of how much this does not work and how much risk it actually poses to our food system, supply chain, the vulnerability, etc. Because of the pandemic. Like, it is much more certain in everyone's mind now that what we have does not work. So we need to figure out a solution. Now, cultivated meat is one of the solutions that potentially can help with fulfilling part of the supply. And that is why investors are still willing to put money into this, because this is really investing into the future, investing in a solution that we are certain we need for the future.
All right, with all of this in place, what would your input to governments in the APAC region that are still debating these regulations be? And perhaps you could also give a message to the firms out there in the sector that, they are trying to put their products out, they're trying very hard to research and stuff, but they're having less success, less progress because, of some regulatory hurdles here and there.
The key really is to have an ongoing conversation, have very honest, open communication between the product developers, so whether it's the startups or corporates are getting into this sector as well, and the regulator, with the common goal that developing cultivated meat into a sustainable, into a safe, healthy product that can really contribute to the whole food system. With that common goal in mind, I don't see why regulators and companies and innovators cannot come together and work much more closely to understand each other and learn from each other and basically develop the sector together.